Hey there, folks. Welcome to this brief review of the American Civil War, 1860 to 1865. I'm Mr. Wilkins, and you may be watching this in my class or Ms. Ptolemy's class at Aurora West College Prep Academy. But here we go. Let's talk about the United States' most devastating and deadliest war. So the Civil War really began back with the founding of the United States. There were some divisions that continued to grow as the United States got older, but we're just going to focus on the events from 1860 to 1865 in this video. And we're going to start with the presidential election of November 1860. This guy in the photograph is Abraham Lincoln. He was a lawyer from Illinois, had served one term in Congress, and he managed to win the presidency. But he only won 40% of the popular vote, but he had a majority in the Electoral College. But with 40% of the popular vote, that meant that he was not a popular president. He just happened to get more votes than the other candidates. Now, he was a Republican. He was the first Republican president. The Republican Party had only been founded in the 1850s, and the main platform of the Republican Party was to stop the spread of slavery. There were some Republicans who wanted to get rid of slavery altogether, but most Republicans simply wanted slavery to stay where it was and not move west as the United States grew. Well, Abraham Lincoln also believed that no state had the constitutional right to leave the United States, and some states had threatened to leave the United States if a Republican won, and argued that it was their constitutional right, but Lincoln did not believe that. Despite his belief, the slave states, many of them saw him as a threat to their way of life, i.e. based on slavery, that Lincoln would push to not just stop the spread of slavery, but to wipe it out. And so, with the election of Abraham Lincoln to the White House, the very next month, in December of 1860, South Carolina seceded, which means they politically separated from the United States. Obviously, South Carolina can't physically move from the United States, but politically they declared that they were an independent state from the United States. This happened just literally a month after Lincoln's election, several months before he was even sworn in as president and had any actual power. Well, South Carolina was soon joined by 10 other southern slaveholding states, and you can see which ones they are on the map to your right. They're the ones colored in gray. Now, all of the states that seceded were slave states, but there were several slave states that actually stayed with the United States. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware remained with the United States for the duration of the Civil War. So fighting broke out in April of 1861 at Fort Sumter, which is just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Confederate troops opened fire on the United States troops, or the Union troops in the fort. Nobody died during the battle. The fort quickly surrendered. But in the first real battle came in July of 1861 at a place called Bull Run, which is in Manassas, Virginia, not that far away from D.C. And what this battle made clear with the number of casualties and the number of dead was that this war would not be over quickly. The Confederacy at the beginning of the war had better trained troops, better military leadership, but the Union had greater resources, and they would put those resources to powerful effect, but it would take them some time, and it would be devastating. So here's some notable battles. We're not really going to get into all the military aspects of this. There are lots of great videos, documentaries, and books you can read to find out, but here are some important ones that you should know. First of all, the Battle of Antietam, which was in Maryland in 1862. This was the bloodiest day in United States history, with 4,000 soldiers killed and over 20,000 who were wounded. To give you an idea about how devastating this is more people, more Americans who were killed than those who were killed in the terrorist attacks of September 11th. The battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863 was the bloodiest battle of the war. It lasted for 4 days, and you had over 7,000 who died and well over 20,000 who were wounded. And this was the last serious attempt by Confederate forces to invade the North and try to force the Union to drop out of the war. The same day that the Battle of Gettysburg ended, the Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi ended, and this gave the Union Army control of the Mississippi River, which divided the Confederacy in half. So now the Union Army controlled this main river that literally was in the middle of the Confederate States. The Battle of Atlanta, Georgia in 1864, the Union Army occupied this city. And this was an important city for the Confederacy because there were a lot of railroad lines that connected in Atlanta. The Battle of Richmond, Virginia in 1865 was a Union victory. The Union Army captured the capital of the Confederacy, which sent Jefferson Davis and other Confederate officials on the run. They would soon be captured or turn themselves over. And then the last real major battle wasn't much of a battle, but it was in Appomattox, Virginia, not far from Richmond. And this is when the Confederacy's most important army, the Army of Northern Virginia, surrendered to Union forces, and other Confederate armies would soon surrender to Union forces as well. Now, here are a few important people that you need to know from this era. Robert E. Lee was the top Confederate general. Ulysses S. Grant was the top Union general and would later be President of the United States in the 1870s. Then you had Jefferson Davis. He was the president of the Confederacy. So he was the Confederate counterpart to Abraham Lincoln. Jefferson Davis had formerly been a senator from the state of Mississippi and was elected to the presidency of the Confederacy. He was the only president the Confederate States of America ever had. Frederick Douglass, who you're familiar with, he was a big advocate for ending slavery and for recruiting African American soldiers to fight for the United States, to fight for the Union. And he met with Abraham Lincoln just a few times and really pushed for the involvement of African Americans and former slaves in the Union Army and in the war effort. Several women also played important roles in this, notably Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix. They organized women to serve as nurses in the battlefield. Clara Barton, in fact, would help found the American Red Cross after the Civil War. They also worked at recruiting and providing medical supplies to use in the field for soldiers. And they also helped with locating and identifying dead and missing soldiers during the war and after, which was very important for the families and friends of these soldiers. This was also a very diverse war. After the adding of territory, Western territory, after the Mexican-American War, you had thousands of Mexican Americans who would end up fighting in the Civil War, most of them for the Union. And many, particularly out of California, served in the cavalry because they were well known as vaqueros. And so they rode on horses. The biggest contribution that they had was in defending New Mexico from Confederate troops. And here are photos of these various figures. Here's Robert E. Lee, the top Confederate general, Ulysses S. Grant, the top Union general, Frederick Douglass, and Clara Barton. One of the most important moments in the Civil War was the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862, right after the Battle of Antietam, which was a Union victory, but it took effect on January 1st, 1863. Now, a lot of times people think that this document freed all the slaves and ended slavery in the United States, but that is not what it did. It was a step in that direction, but slavery in the United States would not end until the passage of the 13th Amendment, which happened after Lincoln died. And even then, slavery was able to continue in certain forms, but that's for another day. Meanwhile, the Emancipation Proclamation did free all the slaves in states and areas that were in rebellion, so that were still controlled by the Confederate States. It did not free slaves in states that were still in the Union, such as Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Probably the most important thing the Emancipation Proclamation did was it allowed for the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army. For the first time, African Americans could fight for the United States. Now they formed separate regiments, which means when they joined the military, they had to serve in what were called color regiments with other African American soldiers. Probably the most famous of these was the 54th Massachusetts. The movie Glory was made about this regiment. By the end of the war, African Americans made up 10% of all U.S. soldiers, and that's around 200,000. And they fought. In fact, they had a higher fatality rate than white soldiers, and around 40,000 African American soldiers did die during the war. So 40,000 out of 200,000. Most of those who died from diseases and from injuries, much like all the soldiers, but still those who did fight fought bravely and accomplished a lot. So fast forwarding to the end of the war in April 1865 and beyond, so Lee's army, the Army of Northern Virginia, surrendered at Appomattox in Virginia, and other Confederate forces soon surrendered. Not even a week after Lee surrendered in April of 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated, was killed in Washington, D.C. at Ford's Theater. He was attending a show there and was shot in his seat in the balcony above the stage in the back of the head. He was shot the night of April 14th and died around 7:30 in the morning on April 15th. 1865. If you visit Washington, D.C., you can go to Ford's Theater and go to the Peterson boarding house where he died, which is directly across the street. And so there's a lot more to that story, but we're going to jump ahead to the larger effects of this war. So the conclusion of this war settled the question of the superiority of the federal government over state governments, although even to this day there's debate about what power the federal government has and what powers the state governments have. In Colorado, for instance, there's a lot of talk about, well, marijuana laws, who controls those? Is it the federal government or is it the state governments? Environmental laws are another big topic where there are arguments between state and federal power. The Republican Party, Lincoln's party, and Northern politicians would dominate national politics in the United States for several decades following this war. You also had the Southern states were physically, economically, politically, and spiritually crushed by their defeat in this war. Although the former slaves, 4 million of them, were happy to be free, but they were not sure what the future held for them. And it would be it'd be a tough road for them in the years to come. No one was really sure what lay in store for the country, for what was going to be called Reconstruction. In the next video, we're going to be looking at Reconstruction. You'll be looking at that more in depth. Now here's a photo, a picture, not a photo, but just a drawing of Lincoln's assassination. The assassin John Wilkes Booth shooting the pistol. He also carried a knife. Abraham Lincoln's wife, the First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln, was sitting next to him, actually holding his hand when he was shot, when he was fatally shot. All right, so another quick summary. And here's a photograph of some dead at, I believe, at Gettysburg. And this photo was taken, colorized many years later. But this is what it would have looked like with these dead bodies left in the field, waiting to be buried. You had over 600,000 Americans dead and missing, the most Americans to die in any conflict in our history. A higher percentage of the dead were Confederate. You had over 500,000 who were wounded, many of these just physically wounded. This isn't even counting the psychological, the mental wounds that many of them suffered. You also had over 4 million newly freed African Americans who were trying to figure out how to enjoy and express their freedom, but they were going to face a backlash from Southern whites and even from their emancipators in the Union Army. And as mentioned before, this strengthened the economic and political power of the northern states, and it devastated every aspect of life in the South. And it would take decades for the South to really recover from the effects of this war. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll be following up in the next video on Reconstruction in the United States.